On the Radar with the CBS 17 Storm Team.
Welcome to On the Radar. This week we've got some awesome topics to discover. And of course, if you watched last week, you had Wes and Rachel. And Rachel is back with us. Always fun to have a Ross and Rachel episode. And obviously, I'm back. I got to enjoy a little vacation time with the family. So we are back to it. And this week, the awesome topics that we are covering, we are talking about the 2025 hurricane season, which was pretty on task, or rather right there where the forecast was expected to be. You may have thought that maybe they missed as far as the forecast outlook goes, but when we go through the numbers, you're going to see that the forecast was actually pretty good. Did we have a whole lot of landfalling systems? No. But the numbers don't lie, and so we'll get to that. We're also going to talk about some more Melissa stuff. If you didn't get enough of it last week with that jaw-dropping video of inside the eye, we're going to talk about some other things inside the eye, mesovortices, and something you've probably never heard of, which is a Fujita whirl. So we're going to talk about both of those. And of course, it is getting to that time of year. And what time of year is that? It's not the sleigh bells jingling or Santa Claus coming. Not just yet.
I don't know. I've seen some decorations get put up, and not just being sold in stores. Like, I legitimately have seen Christmas trees in windows on my drive home. Yeah, and that was before Halloween.
My wife told me that Christmas threw up on Target yesterday. So.
Oh, that's a great analogy. Great job.
So we're not quite there yet. We're talking about the first frost and freezes, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We have Matthew that's going to explain a whole lot for us there. But first, let's get to it. The 2025 hurricane season, and what a season it was. We're nearing the end. And
thank goodness.
Exactly. Thank goodness. So not much more can be said about that. And the good news is, as we do wrap up the hurricane season here, that we're talking about the end. So that's always good. And I think that there's quite a few meteorologists around the country that throw a pizza party or have some kind of party. So I don't know. Maybe we need to create a new tradition for ourselves at the end of hurricane season here, where we toast and
when I was in Fort Myers, they would have a famous person that represented one of the names. They would just find the most random name that correlated with whatever storm, and it was posted up in the weather center. And at the end of every season, we would all get together and we'd take the little faces off of the wall and you put them all in a cup and we burned them. It was actually very cathartic.
I actually really like that.
I know,
that
it's a great
awesome.
idea.
Do we have a fire pit at the station here?
I'm sure someone has a fire pit. But literally we took a coffee mug and shoved them in there.
Oh, you just shoved them in the coffee? Oh, okay.
Yeah, it wasn't like a big, burning of Christmas trees sort of thing.
I'm on board with that.
It was literally just like someone grabbed a coffee mug, threw all of it in there, and then lit it on fire. It was great, though.
I'm on board. That sounds fantastic. I don't know why we're not doing that.
I know,
as
it's
we
a great idea.
Maybe we should have a ceremonial flame that we just put in the corner and we see all the names just slowly go in. Maybe I can do that in editing. Maybe. We'll see. I don't know.
That could be dangerous, though.
That depends on how much time I have.
Do you trust yourself? Do you trust Wes? Do you trust me, Laura, or Matthew with an open flame?
No, I'm saying in editing. I'll put it in the graphic, is what I'm saying. I'm not saying you guys. No, I don't.
I'm still on the open flame part of it.
I don't trust you. I think every meteorologist is slightly a pyromaniac too. So,
as my grandfather, the scoutmaster, said, "Those who play with fire wet the bed." So. I don't know why I just said that.
I've never heard that.
Oh, typical On the Radar, the Ross and Rachel. We're on the rails. Hey, here's some good news. Nothing is expected to develop in the next week. Wow.
Nice pivot.
Yeah.
Nice pivot. Continuing with the 2025 season, we had 13 named storms, 5 hurricanes, and yes, we had 4 major hurricanes. And those major hurricanes really made up for the difference in the fact that we didn't have a whole lot of landfalling systems outside of, unfortunately, the one that just happened most recently, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, which is Melissa. We also had, I think, Imelda briefly make landfall, or Imelda worked through Haiti, so and the Hispaniola and parts of Cuba. We had Chantal make landfall in South Carolina and then work up here in North Carolina.
Us. Mm-hmm.
Lots of flooding there from that system. So even years that really for the U.S. don't feel all that impactful, you can really just take one. It's a lesson that I think everyone eventually learns. Just one storm makes the season impactful. Barry, the remnants of that ended up being the flooding issues in Texas as well on 4th of July. So while the season may not feel dramatic, again, just one storm, and that's really all that makes the difference. And this year, it's really obvious when you look at the tracks. We had a very strong trough that was basically situated just off the East Coast all year long. So as these storms tried to progress off to the west, they hit that trough and they just shot back off to the north and east. So Bermuda was in the target quite a bit, and most of these storms stayed out to sea. So if you looked back at the early season forecast, you saw South Florida, Texas, and East Coast being really the target areas for this season's outlook. And I wouldn't say that that was wrong. If you had had something go underneath that trough, it would have been South Florida or Texas.
Absolutely.
And then obviously there was lots of East Coast threats.
Yeah.
Not much that made it to the East Coast, but lots of threats.
And even if they didn't directly make landfall, we've talked about this before, when Aaron moved off coast, offshore, we had all of these flooding issues and high tide issues along the East Coast. And it was same with so many of these other ones, including Umberto, what was the Imelda that we were talking about? All of those still had some indirect impacts along pretty much the entire Atlantic coast. And it is important to remember, people get so fixated when they see the forecast that they're like, oh my gosh, all of these storms are going to make landfall. And the National Hurricane Center specifically mentions every single season when they release their hurricane forecast, this is not a landfall forecast. This is a number of storms forecast.
Exactly.
And people kind of get caught up in that. Oh my gosh, 20 storms making landfall, or even 13. It's mainly just, again, the number of storms. So, as we were looking at all that, it was, all things considered, a fairly typical, maybe a little more active than average season, at least in terms of, the total number of storms. But most of them stayed out to sea. Yeah. And we're not mad at that. Now, unfortunately, as we mentioned, we've had to talk about Melissa, and there's impacts, Barry, and the eventual remnant moisture that went to Texas. Chantal was barely even a tropical system by the time it impacted us, and it caused so much devastation around here. Like you mentioned, it only takes one, but most of them did end up staying out to sea. Goodness.
Nice catch. It's good reflexes. Talking about wetting the bed and catching mics. I knew I was going to bring that back up at some point in time, but
my grandfather is looking down on me and laughing like hysterically.
It probably is. But just ask the Outer Banks on how impactful storms out to sea can be.
Absolutely.
So,
how many houses have we lost this year in Buxton and Rodanthe just from the rough waters?
Yeah, and you add a nor'easter, an unseasonable nor'easter on top of that, and you're adding more beach erosion, more issues up and down the East Coast. So impactful season nonetheless, and the numbers, again, they don't lie. Actual numbers, 13. NOAA went with 13-19. NC State, 12-15. Colorado State was a little aggressive, going with the above-average stance, which all of them basically said, hey, this season has a chance to be really above average. And again, I don't think that was necessarily wrong. The average number of hurricanes is 7. We only had 5, but we had 4 major hurricanes, and 3 of those being Category 5s. And that makes a significant difference in the overall numbers because we actually ended up with an above-average year as far as ACE goes. So that is accumulated cyclone energy. We should be around 117 to finish the year, and we actually ended up over, let me see the number, I don't want to get it wrong, 132. So we ended up slightly above average as far as accumulated cyclone energy goes. And that's a metric that really doesn't lie. It just shows you how many storms we had and how intense they were, how much energy they ate in the atmosphere. And we've talked about this several times. Hurricanes have a purpose. They are heat sinks. They are literally taking heat out of the ocean and depositing it back into the atmosphere. So they do a job, and a specific job is to take heat out. and they transfer that heat into the atmosphere and up toward the poles, which is why they all curve off to the north. So as we round out hurricane season here, what does that mean as far as November formations go? Well, they're rare. Going back, you only have 42 since 1851. And how many have affected North Carolina? Not many. Out of those 42, you have 5, including the latest landfalling hurricane on record, which is Kate back in 1985. So it's still possible, but it is pretty rare.
Yeah, and we did, I think, have at least a tropical system last year, Raphael, that I think tried to work into the Gulf and ended up falling apart. My memory's not perfect, but I do remember that there was at least something we were tracking even last year into early November. So like I said, it's not impossible, and that's why the season runs through the end of November. But we've also had tropical systems in December. We've had tropical systems in January. I believe the earliest one that ever formed was in January. Now it was out in the open Atlantic, but it did form nonetheless. So we have these seasons to give us that general guideline of this is when it is more likely to occur, and we can kind of see that here. So again, most of our activity is going to be in August, September, and even into October. That is when we have the warmest waters across the main development region, across the Atlantic and across the Gulf. That is when our wind shear is typically a little bit lower. That is also when we typically have less Saharan dust coming off of Africa. So all of these things have sort of, eased up just enough or warmed up just enough that's when peak happens. Everyone thinks, oh, July, it's the hottest time of the year. That's when we should have most of the hurricanes, right? Well, water takes a lot longer to warm up than land or air. So if it's really, really hot in July, it's probably going to take a little time for that water to warm up. And as you mentioned, it kind of also depends too on how many tropical systems we've had, how many overall systems have sort of churned up the water, cooled it down or not. But notice that little 5% in November. It's still possible. It is always possible. We say it with severe weather. We say it with snow. We say it with hurricanes. If conditions are right, something can happen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And just as Rachel said, wind shear plays a huge role in it, because if you look at the water in the Caribbean, you can get a hurricane anytime. The water in the Caribbean never really drops below 87. And because of that, there could be a hurricane down there anytime throughout the year. Mm-hmm. So why do we not see hurricanes, say, in January all that often? And why do they almost never happen in the Caribbean outside of really late season tropical activity? It's because wind shear across the Caribbean is usually massive. We have our trade winds that go through there, and those are divergent across the Caribbean, which means the winds are going in opposite direction, and anything that tries to develop down there just gets ripped to pieces. So it could happen at any point in time during the year, but the only time that we really see the atmosphere cooperate is as we get into late season hurricanes. So September and October, that's usually when we see activity actually come out of the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. Same kind of thing with the Gulf. And the reason for the Gulf is for exactly what we're going to talk about at the end here. It's cold front season. Yeah. We have so many cold fronts coming through that anything that tries to get coming out of the Gulf just gets ripped to shreds. And so that's why hurricane season is really constrained to the months that we see them. It really doesn't have a ton to do with if it's warm enough outside of, as you mentioned, the main development region, which we see fluctuate quite a bit, as well as the Gulf and the Atlantic waters as you go into the subtropics, because obviously colder air. Right. So all of those things help to cool the water down, and then we wait for them to warm up, and then we get our main development season, and then we get our Caribbean and Gulf season. And thankfully, we are now in cold front season, which means we're talking cold. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit more about this year and all of the major hurricanes. We had four major hurricanes. Of course, that was Gabrielle, Umberto, and then you had, my brain has gone blank just because we're on camera.
Aaron, Gabrielle, Umberto, Melissa.
Melissa, that's right.
Yeah.
So those are the four that we had this year.
Major hurricanes.
4 major hurricanes, correct, yes. And going back to 2000, we've had 93 major hurricanes. That sounds like a lot, but it averages out to be a little more than 3.5 per year. So that's right on the average when you look at our climatological mention. What's different between this year and years past, obviously we did a whole on the radar on this.
Yeah.
Which is the rapid intensification and the Category 5s. We had 3 Category 5s. There's only one other season in existence that had more Category 5s than this year.
2005, that infamous season. So obviously Katrina, Rita, Wilma, which a lot of people are going to be comparing Melissa and Wilma to in terms of low pressure, how quickly it rapidly intensified. But also there was Hurricane Emily in 2005. That was also a Category 5. So 4 Category 5s in that season. Again, the only one other than this year that had more than what we had. So 2005, just...
Yeah, that season is just going to haunt us forever. Yeah.
It will be probably the hurricane season that every hurricane season going forward is rated against, other than maybe 2020 for just the sheer volume, the sheer number of storms that we experienced in 2020. But I feel like 2020, 2005, those are going to really be the... standard sounds bad because standard is kind of a positive, thing, but like any hurricane season going forward is going to be compared with 2005 and 2020.
Yeah, the upward bounds, if you will. So kind of the top of the bracket.
Right.
Those are definitely the 2 hyperactive years that we've had in the last couple of decades.
Right.
And certainly you may be looking at this and saying, hey, well, we've had more majors as of late than maybe in decades past.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that has to do with the fact that we are talking about around the year warmer waters.
Yep.
So we already have storm fuel readily available. We're not having to wait as long for the water to get warm enough to be able to create hurricane activity. And the areas that can sustain hurricane activity have grown.
Right.
So all of those things create the ability for there to be more storms and more storm fuel to go into it. Now, the opposite end of that spectrum is observational bias.
Right.
What does that mean? That means we're seeing more now than ever. We've got more data now than ever. And that's all good things. The observational bias is really good things because when you look at the number of fatalities, excluding a couple of anomalies like Helene that happened last year, as well as Harvey in 2017, excluding a couple of anomalies, for the most part, we're talking about far fewer fatalities coming out of tropical systems. And that happens because we are seeing more and we know more about these storms. We're giving better warning further in advance. So people are being able to give to safety much, much better and much more rapidly out of this observation that we're getting.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something that Wes and I talked about last week, and you and I have talked about this before. Obviously, the satellite era of meteorology is kind of what we consider, the modern era, the past 60 years or so. So being able to have satellites constantly looking at the ocean, constantly looking at everywhere, gives us more data that we need. But also the hurricane hunters, again, we had mentioned this before last week, and then you and I, the reason that we knew Melissa had got as strong as it did so quickly was because the hurricane hunters were literally flying into the storm constantly. One would leave and another one would immediately be right back in. So because we have all of this data, as you mentioned, we are able to now get better warnings. People can evacuate earlier or take shelter earlier, and it really does make a difference. Obviously, knowing everything that's going on is a really powerful tool in terms of warning people and keeping everyone safe.
Yeah, and ultimately that's what our job's about, right? We're
Absolutely.
communicators, and we're all on the same goal, and that goal is to send out as good of information as we possibly can so that people can make a rational decision when it comes to tropical activity, severe weather in general, or just the day-to-day, whether it's 70 degrees and sunny or it's 30 degrees and miserable, one or the other.
One or the other. Or somewhere in between.
Yeah. Speaking of Category 5s, obviously Labor Day is going to be a comparison to Melissa because they both made landfall at 892 millibars, which is just scary. And if you want to know where those locations were in the U.S., well, they're not up the East Coast. They're all in Florida for the most part, outside of Camille, which was pretty close on the northern Gulf there. So you've got Camille, Michael, Labor Day, and Andrew. Obviously, Wilma and several other hurricanes in recent past have made it up to Category 5 status. They just didn't make landfall in the U.S. As Category 5s. And that's really a separating factor for this. We're just talking about landfalling systems at Category 5, but But I think you and I talked about this in a previous On the Radar where we were talking about how unfathomable Labor Day hurricane was.
Right.
And then lo and behold, this season wraps up with a Labor Day-esque hurricane across Jamaica. So we're going to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about Melissa that did tie that record with Labor Day as an 892 millibar storm, making it one of the top 5 strongest landfalling systems in the Atlantic. I think it came in at number 3, so I think it was tied with Labor Day at number 3. So we're going to talk more about that when we return.
On the Radar with the CBS 17 Storm Team.
And welcome back. Last we were talking about major hurricanes, specifically Category 5 hurricanes, and Labor Day is where we left off, obviously tying the record with Melissa that just happened in Jamaica. And you guys, you and Wes, you talked a lot about this storm last week, the turbulence in the eye.
Yeah.
And we've got some mesmerizing video here from the eye making landfall. Walk us through what we're seeing.
I mean, it really is just kind of crazy looking at this. So this is from Sierra, who does satellite imagery for NOAA. And this is a zoomed in look at the eye as it approaches Jamaica. So you can see it is so impressive, and then it makes landfall. Well, let's think about Jamaica. By the time it moves over the very mountainous part of that country, of that island, it really starts to fall apart. So tropical systems, they like a few things. They don't like wind shear. So they really like nice calm winds, all the way up. They like really warm water, but they don't like friction. They don't like being over land because remember, water is its source of energy. So as it moves over land, it's not just the interaction with land, because by this point, Melissa was finally starting to move a little more quickly. It's the mountainous terrain. So that mountainous terrain can really rip apart tropical systems. So that's part of the reason why it kind of lost that eye structure so quickly. It moved over that terrain that was not favorable because it's really high up. It's sort of cutting off any lingering moisture that was, hanging on, but also just ripped it apart because of friction and things like that. And you hear a lot about this too when we're tracking tropical systems moving over Hispaniola or moving over parts of Cuba. Is it going to thread the needle between the most mountainous regions? Because sometimes that can allow more strengthening if it avoids that rough terrain. Again, in this point, it definitely weakened. It didn't look as good on satellite as it moved over the mountains, but it was still, I believe, a major hurricane by this point and managed to re-strengthen back to a hurricane once it emerged off of the mountains and back over water. But it really is just a fascinating imagery. But Ross has been really, really into what's been going on right inside the eye. The eye is impressed, but tell me that doesn't put you in a trance.
It definitely, it's definitely, the hypnotist just dangling the clock in front of you.
This is
sure.
Super zoom of super zooms, into the eye itself. So we kind of had the bigger view as it was moving over Jamaica. This is right
on
there.
The eye. And this is such a cool video because you can actually see the inner workings of the hurricane itself.
Yeah.
Not only are we looking at this where it looks like it's almost spinning anticyclonically, and that's because of where we're zoomed in on the center, and you're focused in on the mesovortices that are rotating around the eye wall. So you see those little swirls, not the one in the center, that's kind of a shed vortice, but the ones that are actually embedded in the eye wall. These mesovortices help to strengthen and even increase the intensity of the hurricane themselves. So when hurricane hunters are measuring the lowest pressure, they're not necessarily measuring the lowest pressure dead in the center of that eye. More or less, they're probably getting a lower pressure in those mesovortices. So as they're circulating around inside that eye, they're dropping dropsons. And when they measure 892 like they did out of this system, it was probably coming from one of those areas of extra spin that were inside the eye wall. And this usually creates, unfortunately, enhanced damage. So when you see these mesovortices rotate inland and make landfall, those little extra areas of spin will enhance winds at the surface. And there's a big difference between the winds at the surface and what we actually see winds elevated, so where their flight radar is going and where they're getting the measurements from in the hurricane. And that's represented for what we see in the aftermath of hurricane damage. So what does that mean when we're looking at this? Well, there's a difference comparison to what we actually usually look at, which most people have the best comparison to tornado damage. Or in severe weather, more mid-latitudes here is going to be microburst and straight line wind damage, which is actually more of what you see in hurricanes versus the tornado-esque damage. Where that comes from is those mesovortices and even smaller pieces of vorticity that happen inside of a wind field called Fujita whirls. And I think the best explanation of this is think about paddling down a creek. The creek is going in the same direction that you are paddling. When you put that paddle in and you go in the opposite direction of the creek, you get little pieces of spin to develop on the outside of that paddle, but they're moving in the same direction as the current. And that's exactly what happens in wind. So as wind, one piece of energy is catching up to another in a wind gust. Between the two of them, there's a relative difference between that wind speed that creates an area of spin. And on that area of spin that's going in the same direction, guess what? You're enhancing the wind speed. So are there actual condensation tornadoes happening in hurricanes? Probably not. But are there...
Not in that eye wall.
No, not in that eye wall. But are you seeing enhanced areas of wind speed and possibly even this rowing type of damage effect where you have wind pulling toward the same damage point? Sure, that absolutely happens. We see that when we look at hurricane damage. And we can see that right here. In the Jamaica before and after video, we can see this type of damage, which is far more compressional and straight line wind than anything else that you're going to see. You're not going to see this rowing type of effect. You're going to see just mass damage, and that's what you have here. You don't see any areas of damage here where you've got a line or a linear segment that happened because of a tornado. It's just widespread, unilateral, one direction type of damage, which is far closer to straight line winds.
Yeah, and that is something too where, especially for anyone who grew up in the Midwest or the Northern Plains or anything like that, you know, we talk a lot about derechos, those long-lived windstorms. And when I was growing up, a lot of people would mischaracterize derechos as inland hurricanes. That's not correct, obviously, but it got that classification because of the same thing. It would have wind speeds possibly up to around hurricane force as that derecho is moving through, and it just blew over everything in its path. And we can see that again. You're seeing a before and after in Jamaica. It's just that wind and the water, but in this instance we're talking about the winds, just blew absolutely everything over in its path. You didn't have a lot of those individual whirls or sort of different patterns like what we were talking about before. It's just devastating, awful hurricane force winds. I mean, roofs totally gone, all of these buildings just totally decimated. It really is just heartbreaking.
Well, I said that we were going to have a video with Matthew explaining our first cold snaps and frost and freeze, but it is a Ross and Rachel episode, which means we talked way too much.
Sorry, Matthew.
So, Matthew, I do have to apologize. We are out of time with that, but we will end with something a little more positive here versus what we had going on, talking about all of the mass devastation in the video that we're seeing there. And that is, of course, our earliest freeze about the beginning of October. And as of recording this on November 5th, we haven't had an official freeze just yet. But if you are paying attention to the forecast going into next week, looks like we could be right there. And so that is just slightly behind the normal average, which is around November 2nd, where we typically see. And of course, you can see last year, we didn't have one until the end of November.
It's kind of a late first freeze last year for sure, at least across the triangle. But I feel like we all know that it's going to have to happen eventually. We're going to have that first freeze. We're going to have to bundle up and finally break down and turn on the heat. Or if you're like me, you've already turned it on at least once. But hey, if you're holding out, you probably won't be able to hold out early next week.
next week. The cold is coming. Or if you're watching this next week, you're probably in the middle of that cold snap as we speak. So that's where we're going to wrap it up. I am going to say the winter time is my favorite time of year because A, we have less severe weather, and B, we're not talking about hurricanes.
True.
Which is a win-win in my opinion.
And we won't go over time in our On the Radar episodes.
We're definitely going to go over time in all of our On the Radar episodes. Come on, Rachel. Let's be realistic.
Yeah, I know.
But that's going to do it for this week's On the Radar. Make sure to check out the latest every week. You can do that on CBS17.com. Or if you're watching this on the Roku app, congrats to you. And yay. You can also catch the videos on YouTube as well on the CBS 17 YouTube channel. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns and you want to send us something, send it to weather@cbs17.com. We'll get those those questions out there. I'd like to do a segment where we just answer you guys' questions on the radar. So
that'd be great.
That would be fantastic. But that's going to do it for this week.